You have to understand the American indoctrination system, I don't call it the education system, is nothing but a system to indoctrinate you into lies and white supremacy. And I say that because when they talk about history, they have the straight skewed history, lied to us, and it was a great waste of my time to sit in their school. So you have a particular sister, her name is Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. She's an associate professor of history at UC Berkeley. Now, her findings, she revealed that Southern white women played a heavier role in the enslavement of Africans as previously thought. Her findings shown that 40% of the slave owners were actually white women. Now, most of the movies that you've seen don't show that at all. They show nothing but white men being slave masters, okay? And that is not accurate, not at all. Now, there's one movie, if you ever seen it, called Goodbye Uncle Tom. It is one scene, they was having a slave auction, and this particular Caucasian female came up to the slave, looking at him. She looked at his phallus, started fooling around with his phallus, and then she wanted to buy him after that. And then the white men saw that, and they're like, no, they started bidding on him or whatever, so she couldn't get the particular slave. So yes, they did participate in the owning of slaves as well. They wasn't just sitting there and being like, oh, well, I'm just not doing anything. You have to understand from the beginning, it's been a team effort. It hasn't been just a one-sided effort when it comes to racism and white supremacy. Now, the sister wrote a book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. The sister described in her book that they typically gave their daughters more enslaved people than land. So they say what that meant was that their very identities as white Southern women are tied to actual or possible ownership of other people. That was according to history.com. So they say her book also notes that owning enslaved Africans served as white women's primary source of wealth, plus owning a large number of enslaved people reportedly made women better marriage material. So they were all tied in. They say once wed, white women were said to have fought and frequently won the right to continue to have ownership over the enslaved Africans, not handing over ownership to their husbands. They say for them, slavery was freedom, according to what the professor has stated. Now, they said after Martha Washington married President George Washington in Virginia in 1759, George is said to have possibly owned around 18 slaves. The first president of the United States, George Washington, owned 18 slaves. They didn't teach us that in school at all, did they? They didn't even talk about that. They talk about, oh, George Washington was the first president. Oh, he's such a great president. But yet he was a slave owner. That's it. But his wife, one of the richest women in the state, owned 84 and dramatically increased this local slave population. So she owned more slaves than her own husband. Now, they said that arguing that white women are trained to be engaged in slavery at a young age, they say they're exposed to the slave market is not something that begins at adulthood. It had began when they were little girls, and they enslaved people as gifts. Okay, so they was giving our ancestors to white women just as gifts, even as children. So there's interviews that was conducted with formerly enslaved people back in the 1930s. One formerly enslaved woman said that children would ruthlessly beat enslaved people. Okay, it said it didn't matter whether the child large or small, they always beat you till the blood ran down. They say white women also reportedly got involved in the slave market aside from beating slaves once they owned them. They say white women bought, sold, and sought out their return. The notion flips the previous belief that white women abstained from engaging in such activity as it was deemed improper. So it's busting up the narrative that it was all just a white man. Remember, they said 40% of the slave owners were white women. They say as the women got pregnant and had their own families, they reportedly orchestrated sexual assaults between enslaved people so that the enslaved black women could be available to nurse white women's children. Now, there are pictures of that. I actually have one of those pictures, but I can't just show you that here on YouTube. But it's actually a black woman sitting there nursing a white child. So this white woman would have a child and didn't want her own child to breastfeed from her. She wants the child to go breastfeed from the black woman. So the black woman's child couldn't even have milk because the white child would go dry her breast all up. And you heard what they said, that they will orchestrate sexual assaults just to get black women pregnant, which is sad. Rape has been used as a weapon against black people for a very long time. This in addition to tearing enslaved women's babies away from them so they can nurse white women's children. So if a lot of times the black women were not pregnant, they'll make sure they were raped by either the white man, or they'll make another slave rape them just so they can be pregnant, so they can breastfeed their children. They had advertisements for that. They say it was big business for lactating black women. So it stated that the instances in which formerly enslaved people did in fact say that their mistress either sanctioned acts of sexual violence against them that were perpetrated at the hands of white men, or they orchestrated instances of sexual violence between two enslaved people that they own and host producing children from those acts of sexual violence. They say white women also have gone through great lengths to maintain ownership of their slaves after the Civil War raged on. Okay, so it's a history.com reported that one white woman, Martha Gibbs, forced enslaved Africans to Texas and threatened them with a gun to continue working for her through 1866, a year after slavery was officially abolished. Now, you know, it's June 19, 1865, Juneteenth, but yet you had brothers and sisters still working for a Martha Gibbs. Even after the institutional outlaws, Southern white women repeatedly doled out work contracts that exploited black people to work under slave-like conditions. Some described it as a benign industry, as Margaret Mitchell did in Gone with the Wind, the same idea that carried out through the textbooks discussing enslavement today. As recently as 2018, it was exposed that students in Texas have been using a textbook that stated not all enslaved Africans were unhappy. That's a BS lie. So this particular professor, Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, has put this out and opened up the door even more on slavery here in America. You know, for the fact is how all these years they just sat up there and lied and put it all on the white man. And he's the slave master. He did this and he did that. And they portrayed the women as, oh, they were just there. And then one thing she didn't talk about that I learned also is that they'll make slaves participate in orgies as well. And they couldn't do nothing about it. So it was a lot of sick things going on to our brothers and sisters. So it's interesting definitely to get more information, and I want to know your guys' thoughts on this, about the new finding of 40% of the slave masters were Caucasian female. And how do you feel about them lying to you once again, like she had nothing to do with slavery, she was just there, she didn't have no rights, etc., but yet she had a right to own slaves?